Okay, let me get one thing out of the way. The Empire is dumb, sometimes really dumb, and Lord knows I've done my fair share of criticizing, especially when it comes to, say, Star Destroyer design. However, I must admit, perhaps I've been a bit too hard on Sheev and the boys. Today, we'll be talking about why the Empire perhaps isn't quite as stupid as you think. Before we get into today's content, I just want to remind everyone who's watching my Empire at War series that episode 2 is being released today, probably by the time this video is up, and will be on my second channel. Link to that in the description. So, after the Clone Wars, the galaxy, for the first time in thousands of years, moved from a voluntary democracy, where systems and individuals were given a high degree of autonomy, to an overbearing, violent autocracy, which imposed its will upon the galaxy. Now, if we accept that this violent model of governing is a required element of the Empire which must be preserved, which I think is fair, or else it's fundamentally changed and no longer, well, the Empire, I think we can see that most of the military decisions at least make a degree of sense. The main obstacle to managing a galaxy-spanning empire is scale. The Republic, for most of its history at least, kept the peace by making membership to the government voluntary and by offering advantages with few imposed restrictions. This is obviously not the case with Palpatine's empire, which very strictly imposed its will against the citizens of the galaxy. Obviously, this increases the probability of violent uprising, so some degree of force is needed to keep systems in line. And this is where the issue of scale comes in. The galaxy is just too big, with millions upon millions of inhabited systems. There's just no way to police this traditionally, and even at the height of their power, the Empire only had tens of thousands of Star Destroyers. So there's a disparity here of at least several orders of magnitude. The structure of the Empire was thus built around this problem. And I think there were three main prongs to their strategy. First is the centralization of power. And I mean this not only because Palpatine himself and his sycophants were all powerful, but also because the majority of the Empire's legal authority and their economic and manufacturing base was centered in the galactic core. The core itself is a much more manageable area, at least in astrographic terms, and although spreading propaganda across the entire galaxy is certainly impossible, one can significantly change the mindset of people in one limited area, mostly through non-stop propaganda campaigns, limits on the arts and free speech, control of the holonet and reporters, etc., etc. Of course, in the core of your empire, you also do less overtly evil things. You won't be throwing the elites of Coruscant into slavery, for example, at least not routinely. So you disproportionately keep assets in one area, the core, keeping your centers of politics, science, and culture believing in the ideals of your empire. Now, of course, propaganda exists across the galaxy, but the real indoctrination is happening in this area. So you have a pacified heart to your empire, providing not only stability, but the lifeblood of day-to-day operations. And I mean that in a literal sense. You have loyal imperial families churning out new admirals, politicians, officers, bureaucrats, soldiers, whatever. These are the people who exert power on a day-to-day basis. And these are people who are loyal to Palpatine and who are loyal to the government. And this is why most people higher up in the military have core world accents or Coruscanti accents. And also why nepotism is rampant. Sure, you're not always getting the cream of the crop rising, but you are embedding loyalty within your government structure. Another effect of this, of course, is that with a higher resource allocation to core systems, they are generally much safer, so you're not having Imperial Center subject to random attacks by your enemies. Of course, this still leaves the vastness of the rest of the galaxy, and again, millions upon millions of systems, all which could house the beginnings of a new rebellion, or which could attempt succession. How do you handle that? Well, let's go to the second prong of the Imperial policy trident, which is the oversector system. A few weeks ago, we talked about subsidiarity, the principle that the most local capable power should be the one making decisions. Obviously, in the Empire, a fascist dictatorship, that's not possible. But still, the galaxy was subdivided into 20 oversectors, with Grand Moffs exerting local political and military control, with a further 1,000 subservient Moffs spread throughout these oversectors. This allows for a degree of oversector, sector, and in some cases planetary specialization when it comes to military rule. control, while also generally allowing timely responses to most emergencies or insurrections. Most oversectors would have also had at least one dreadnought or big symbol of Imperial power, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. However, the oversector system also had some major issues which I think I would be remiss to ignore. Mainly, oversectors and the Moffs that ran them would often not work together due to a degree of protectionism over their power, leading to an overall inefficiency in the Empire. The issue of power is really the main driver here. We know the Alliance, for example, would purposefully put Grand Moffs or Moffs against each other. They would attack sensitive systems near oversector borders, then moving across the border itself, where the nearby Grand Moff would either not properly respond to the threat or might prevent Imperial starship movements. The problem is, it's really difficult to prevent this sort of competition against people power hungry enough to rise to the position of Grand Moff, but fostering a higher degree of unity among those in power, from leaders of the military to political Grand Moffs, Moffs, and even planetary governors, would have been a good first step. However, even with smart asset division, the Empire and the forces of the Imperial Navy are still a minority compared to the combined powers of the rest of the galaxy. This is where the third prong of Imperial policy, the Tarkin Doctrine, comes in. Basically, the idea that overwhelming, unassailable force and the associated fear will keep systems in line. So it's true, the Empire doesn't have an unending string of Star Destroyers, and if every system revolted against the Empire, they could probably overthrow the government. And that's true for a military even much larger than the Empire, I would think. In response, you create psychological weapons like the Death Stars, which, more than being an actual useful military force, is a symbol that resistance against the Empire is impossible. The same can be said of Star Dreadnoughts, and to a lesser extent, even the Star Destroyer. Basically, the idea that, yeah, you might be able to resist us and even be successful, but eventually the Executor or some superweapon is going to show up and make you pay. You will not be able to resist, and you will die. Obviously, this works well against systems and planets, but the Tarkin Doctrine does struggle against stateless entities like the Alliance. And this failure exposes some of the Empire's other major weaknesses. For example, the fact that they didn't eliminate major sources of Alliance revenue or ships, like Mon Cala, or more importantly perhaps, the fact that they didn't have better designed mainline capital ships, or starfighters. My point is, the Star Destroyer, for example, is a great image to conjure fear and to keep systems in line, just through its mere presence. However, when you're fighting a faction that will use hit-and-run tactics, the fear isn't there, and the design flaws inherent in the Star Destroyer, like the lack of really good point defense weapons or better starfighters, are exposed. The thing is, this wasn't an either-or situation, and the Empire really could have upgraded their ships while still maintaining an element of fear. So looking at the Death Star specifically, if we strictly abide by Legends credit numbers, which I highly recommend against, then the fact that we could replace the DS-1 with 10,000 Star Destroyers misses the point. Yeah, that would swell the galactic numbers somewhat, but the Empire already had an absolutely overwhelming military advantage, against the Rebellion at least. The psychological impact, I think, is much more useful. To further the effects of the Tarkin Doctrine, the Empire smartly invested extremely heavily in starship design, while also limiting the advancements in non-Imperial vessels. So the difference between the average ship in the Imperial military and the average ship in any other galactic fighting force continued to widen. And we know that strategy would have been continued with the Eclipse and the Sovereign line of Star Destroyers. So to summarize, it's my opinion that if one has to rule through a violent dictatorship, that the Empire was best set up, or at least well set up, for success. The main thing that led to the government's failure was the destruction of the Death Stars. Had the first not been destroyed, the largest rebel cell against the Empire would have been annihilated, and there most likely would have been a chilling effect on other rebellions. The same can be said of the second Death Star. However, even if the Empire had lost at Endor, all they needed was for Palpatine to survive, and I truly think they would have been completely fine. Palpatine held the faction together. After his death, the Empire splintered into holdouts, warlords, and claimants to the throne. This infighting detracted from the fact that they still had an overwhelming military advantage against the Rebellion and the later New Republic. We see in the Dark Empire that even with the Empire crumbling and the New Republic having militarized, Palpatine's forces are still absolutely overwhelming. So the main issues are the arrogance of Palpatine, which arguably is not the fault of the Empire structure, though I think that point could be debated, and the competitiveness of especially Over-Sector Grand Moffs and the lack of a coherent chain of command after the Empire. So for an autocratic galactic government, I think you could do worse than the Empire. That being said, when ruling a galaxy, I do think the Republic or New Republic democratic voluntary model is much more successful. That, however, is just my opinion. I would love to hear what you think. Today's question of the day comes from Titan Fail, who asks about gifts for Star Wars fans, very timely for this time of season. First of all, I know Alex and Molly from Star Wars Explained will put out a fully comprehensive gift guide at some point. They do every year. As for my suggestions, for a canon fan, I would highly suggest the art book for The Force Awakens or The Last Jedi. Even if you didn't like one of the movies, the art book for Episode 7 especially is absolutely fascinating. Otherwise, for fans of both, I think Lego is always a really fun gift, or some sort of Audible gift card. For Legends fans, I think the Star Wars Encyclopedia is just one of the most fun things ever, because you can basically just flip to any page and learn something new or obscure, but I would also recommend the Essential Guide to Warfare or one of the Legends book collections, or of course just a nice copy of one of the movies. But of course it all depends on the recipient. Thank you so much for asking. If you guys want to ask me something, make sure to leave a comment with the hashtag AskEck. That is how I find them when I search through the comments. Anyway, until next time guys, this has been EckhartsLadder. May the Force be with you.